Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for February through May. Over the last 30 days, we've seen much warmer than normal conditions across nearly all of the Great Basin with the exception of eastern Utah. We will actually end the month 10 to 15 degrees above normal over the northern half of the Great Basin in January. Looking at the precipitation, we've had very dry conditions over southern areas of the Great Basin as storm systems have been targeting the Pacific Northwest into Idaho. So it's these areas of Idaho into parts of western Wyoming that have seen above normal precipitation for the last 30 days. Most other areas have seen little to no precipitation, especially in far southern Nevada and the Arizona Strip. Over the last few months, since October 2019, we have seen this trend basically continue with wetter conditions over southern areas, at least early in the period towards October and November before conditions have dried out. Elsewhere across the basin over the last couple of months, precipitation remains below normal. Looking at the snowpack, we have been seeing near to above normal snowpack only over the eastern portion of the Great Basin, especially across Utah into northern Arizona. Further west, most of the snowpack is near to just below normal. Areas that have been on the wetter side recently across western Idaho, central Idaho, and over into western Wyoming are seeing conditions right around normal for the time of year. Soil moisture remains fairly low across the Great Basin due to this drier weather we've been seeing recently. The Evaporative Demand Drought Index also shows no real significant conditions of drought expected across the Great Basin, at least at the present time. There are a few drier spots over western Nevada into northern Utah, as the areas have been, again, on the drier side, but right now no significant drought conditions across the Great Basin. And looking at the drought monitor as of the end of January, again, those drier spots up across Idaho, and then still even across Utah, we are seeing some drought conditions. However, those areas of Utah have seen moisture recently. Looking at the outlook that takes us to the end of April, we may see some drought continue to develop over parts of Idaho into Utah, depending on how much moisture we receive. Looking at some of the moisture conditions, the 10-hour fuel moisture shows still fairly high fuel moisture over the northern half of the Great Basin, just due to their cooler nighttime temperatures and higher humidities. And then over southern areas on the drier side, over southern Nevada into the Arizona Strip, we're seeing moisture below 5 or 6%. 100-hour fuel moisture is showing that same trend, much higher over the northern half of the Great Basin, and similar in 1,000-hour moisture as well. One thing we still will have to deal with is the grass fuel loading from the last couple of years. So far this season, throughout the winter and heading into the early part of the spring, we haven't really seen very many indications of lower elevation snowpack or snowfall staying on the ground for long periods of time. Therefore, we're not expecting at this point much compaction of the fine fuels from last year. So we still may have some new carryover to deal with from the new growth we saw late last spring into the summer with the wetter conditions, and we'll continue to monitor that over the next couple of months. If we do continue to remain on the drier side, or once we finally start getting storms, most of the snow remains in the higher elevations, we again will be looking at some of that carryover crop to impact the fire season as we go into 2020. So now that we've looked at the past conditions over the last few months, we'll go into the outlook for the next few months. Looking at the 8 to 14 day outlook, which takes us from February 17th through the 13th, showing a cooling trend over the western half of the U.S. So we will see cold fronts drop down and drop our temperatures from the warm and above normal temperatures we have been seeing to much below normal. We'll also see precipitation mainly over the eastern side of the Great Basin and over the rest of the country with the exception of far western areas. So Nevada over into California and the Pacific Northwest will be on the cooler, drier side of these storms. Looking at La Nina and El Nino and where we are currently, we have been in a state of neutral conditions, so we are not seeing El Nino or La Nina at the present time, and will likely stay in this neutral category really through much of the year. We are seeing some of the models, or at least the majority of the models, trending downward with sea surface temperatures, so we may see more of a trend to negative sea surface temperatures, but still remaining in that neutral category. We are again seeing, as we move towards later in the summer and towards the fall, that potential for La Nina to develop, where cold temperatures and the sea surface start developing, but again, that's fairly uncertain that late in the year. Looking at our 1 month outlook, taking us through the rest of February, we will likely see at times some warmer conditions, with the exception of those cold fronts moving through. So later in the month, we might start to see temperatures start to warm again, and along with continued drying conditions, possibly on the western side of the Great Basin, with most of the moisture targeting the eastern half of the region. Looking from March through May, we're seeing more of a warmer and drier trend. But as we move more towards April and May, towards the end of this outlook, we may actually see some moisture start to develop again across the Great Basin. So we may see some conditions of wetter than normal as we get later in the spring towards April and May. And again, that would mainly be if we're seeing warmer and wetter conditions, more in the form of rainfall, possibly some thunderstorms, but we'll continue to monitor that as we get later in the outlook. So putting everything together right now, we're just looking for normal conditions across the Great Basin from February through May. That typically means minimal fire activity, but as things continue to dry out at times, with the fine fuels still in place on the ground and not compacted, we could see some upticks of fire potential with human starts as the temperatures start to warm and we go through the spring. Aside from that, we're generally looking at lower fire potential, and if the conditions do transition to possibly a wetter pattern at times in April and May, which is what some of the models are indicating, right now we're not looking at an early start to fire season. That concludes our outlook for this month. Check back in early March for the next outlook.